Welcome again to Quarantine Talks from the Kitchen. Tonight it's just me, no guest. So I'm gonna pick up with, it's not related per se. I'm gonna pick up from the third one, that was Francis Bacon. So, but in the sequence is a little bit what I said at the beginning of this, which the one that it will be on my end. There are talk about my own interests and obsessions as a designer. As I always said, disclaimer, I'm not a scholar in any of the subjects, like any designer or architect is really. But they are much more fueled by my own interest and how these things have been shaping and why I think it's relevant, or why I think it's important for us in architecture to talk about this. Some of them are more obvious, some of them are less obvious, some of them are more absurd. But again, the intention of this conversation were a little bit to be like that we were talking in somebody's kitchen, in this case, my kitchen, my house kitchen, to talk about things that you're looking at, paying attention to, pretty much like all architects, we talk to each other or designers and so on. So, without further delay, let's get going with this. Hold on. So, as I said, this one is on the subject of fashion, but it's not all about fashion. It's not an historical class about fashion. It's about certain characters and character of the field, with a couple of caveats and why I think it's an interesting. Years ago, Emmanuel Petit, who is a fairly interesting theory and historian, gave a talk in SCI-Arc in which he was talking about how fashion didn't have a discourse and how other creative field didn't have a discourse, and that what made him so interested in architecture. And I think to an extent he's right. Like the fashion as a creative field is not really one that is a discourse. There's a certain amount of criticism right now, but it's so intertwined with the notion of commerce and with the notion of production, which operate in those terms. That being said, the reason why I find it so, hey man, you're in your kitchen too, so from kitchen to kitchen. So one of the things I find so interesting about fashion is, in many ways, I would argue that it shapes our lives more than any other creative field. It surrounds us, infects us, even those who don't pay attention to it or pay too much attention or so on and so forth. And I don't wanna undermine the certain superficiality that comes with it and certain one. But if we understand this at the intersection of creative and commerce, it's one of the most fascinating ones, particularly in the last 70 years, in terms of the evolution of technology, creative thinking, social behavior, and many other things an architect aspires. So this started years ago. I always been interested in fashion, but around the middle of 2005, 2006, there was a lot of conversations about many people were looking into automatization of technology, and they were looking out of car design, another one. And occurred to me, and I'm not the only one, and I think Devin was around. Devin is somebody who also I know many times she talks about fashion and the interest in fashion in relation to technology. But I thought in many ways that architecture have much more in common with fashion in terms of the relation of the things that they have with car design or other things. Even though fashion is mass produced and is mass sell, the runway and the haute couture and the ideas remain still one of a kind. So it's one piece on it that they need to be deployed in some kind of repetitive and so on. But the other thing which I said is this picture, which these are street fashion from all over the place and all over the world of different cultures and different races and different sexual orientation and so on. It surrounds us, it shapes us, influence us even when we don't pay attention. So I choose certain characters that I find that they are the one that I find it interesting personally. But the reason I find it interesting is because in a strange way, they all have like a love-hate relation with the commercial side of fashion. They were all much more obsessed with the idea to bring art or another kind of a much more cutting-edge way to think about it. I mean, we may not think that about Coco Chanel by now because Chanel is such an established brand, but when she started, this was a moment that we were transitioning from people or tailors or men or women that were making clothes for people. And this was one of the first one, if not the first one, idea of a global brand of fashion. And the idea that it became like a series of, she will have a lot of manifestos, and she will, I would not say it was a discourse, but her ambition were beyond about doing just a good figure and so on. It also was in parallel with the idea of the feminist movement and certain arguments and so on. But she was in many, many ways, like we will do a parallel in architecture with somebody like Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe. There were a moment of inflection in which these things start to take a different dimension. But one thing I will say that what I separate the fashion designers or the fashion minds that I'm interested in versus other ones is that they all have an obsession with what I will call incremental fiction as a product of desire. Is the idea that it also created parallel reality. It's all built on the idea of the runway, this notion of impossible clothes and impossible desires. But the other thing which is interesting to think about it is there is a very common parallel or even ahead of the curve of many other creative disciplines. And this have to do with certain basic notion of commerce. Like each fashion house by now, they had to do what it used to be 4 collections a year, now get multiplied by 4 because each of them have multiple brands and so on. But if you think somebody like Pierre Cardin in the 60s, there was a lot of thinking and a lot of manipulation, not only of technology, but about the relation between the body and fabric and the relation how we cover us and how to start to detach the idea of the body from the dress in this case. So he will start to experiment with a lot of very suggestive and incredibly sophisticated form of geometry in which the object is, of course, is close to be wear and so on, but by itself, it starts to have its own autonomy. So somebody like Pierre Cardin starts to think almost to the detachment between the garment from the body, or the idea that the garment from the notion that was only to be wear. It's not something to be wear only, it's something to be understand, appreciate, and relate to it by himself. So he did a whole series. I mean, he was an incredibly innovator in the field, and of course, it was also one of the very few, not few, was one of the very first that they create this notion of a global brand. The idea that you start to create not only clothes, but you start to create perfumes, furniture, the whole idea of lifestyle, the whole idea of the manipulation of the notion of an identity that can transcend the idea of a brand. And of course, this was not so much done with the sophistication of today. It was not so much done with the idea of ultra commerce that we have today, or the global companies that we have today. This was done in a different way, still in a much more artistic manner, in a more atelier manner, in a more signature manner, a more stylistic manner. But if you can see, there is also another interesting, fascinating thing about fashion, which is the notion of motif and inspiration and signature. The idea that fashion is much more comfortable with the notion to borrow from the past, from borrowing from another discipline and appropriate it, and they're much more evident about it, and they talk much more openly about it than an architect will talk about it. But if you think about all the work that he was doing, this is again in the 60s, it's an extraordinary sophisticated. If you compare what was going on in architecture in the 60s, for example, this is a way more radical. Is a way more radical think about shape, form, material, texture, colors. And even the way that he would start to think about the display of it, the architecture of the interior space, about the stores about it, the whole, again, the notion of immersive experience. So it's not just a good, it's not just a product, it's a whole idea of a construction of a fiction in which you're a willing participant. So if you think about many of the things that we discussed today and we talk about today in the school, it relates to many of these ideas. And another interesting character in the 60s and 50s and 60s, very radical one, and in the 70s is Paco Rabanne. Paco Rabanne will go even further than Pierre Cardin, because he will start to think the dress is completely autonomous from the body. Of course, he has certain concessions for it, but even the way that he will start to think about it, when you will buy one of the Paco Rabanne dress, this is what you will be buying. You will be buying a box set. It will come with metal pieces and the tool for you to assemble the dress. So it was not even the idea of the figure. you will add as many pieces as you need and self-assembly and so on, but also unusual materials that were not even fabric, it was a metallic thing. But the whole notion about that you're buying an identity that is boxed for you and then is about to you to manipulate and to articulate and how you will deploy that into your body. And of course that then again, like no different than let's say the car design with the car prototype and so on, in finding ways to become mass produced and to become done in different materials and cheaper materials and so on. But there is something really fascinating about how high fashion is born about one of a kind. Each collection is one piece and one piece only, and then that inspired a whole series of mass production. That's a different way to think about the pretty much any other creative field, and this is something that is something I always been fascinated by it. And architecture, we don't do like that because it's all one of a kind. But I would argue that there is a narrative, and there is an alphabet, there is a glossary, there is a language that everybody develops one way or another. So moving much closer to today, John Galliano, which is this great figure because he got drunk or he was on drugs and he did improper things, so he got fired his position as the creative director of Dior, and now he's the creative director for Maison Margiela. But the reason why I wanted to put Galliano is because Galliano, who like Alexander McQueen went to St. Martin Central Academy in London, he and Alexander McQueen, I will call it the bridges between the tradition of let's say the tradition and the craft and the ability of the auteur of the somebody you can cut fabric your own, you can sew, you can design. So the tradition of high couture into the notion of pret-a-porter, ready to wear, that most of the companies now are built around now today. But I think John Galliano started to understand this idea. He also started to incorporate a much more clear sense of the spectacle and the performance and the show business of the runway. So in which the runway is not just any longer just to present a line of products that it would inspire something else, but it became a product by itself and an articulation of the message of what you're trying to do. So as I was saying, by now, people are like, there are established brands and there's still some few names, but a lot of people right now is becoming much more in the way that the big architecture office work. There is a creative director, there's multiple teams, they supervise collection, they have to have multiple concepts for multiple products, from glasses to perfumes, socks, furniture, clothes, high couture, all the things into one. And you have to have some kind of a coherency, but it's a coherency that can be interchangeable and it has to be replaced every time. And it has to be replaced multiple times. And I know that architecture and architecture education is predicated in the opposite. The idea that architecture is timeless, architecture have to always be in the present, and it have, which I always thought is there is a sense of responsibility because the commerce of it and how much it costs. I mean, fashion, even a very expensive dress, a super expensive dress, you will spend $10,000, which is a lot of money to spend in a dress, but it's nothing compared what it costs to do a decent house as a designer. So there is those problems of immediacy, which are different problems. But at the same time, I never bought that argument that architecture is timeless. I think what we understand is the Bill Savoy, for example, is relevant because we know it was done what it was done. It's not timeless. When I look at the Bill Savoy, it represents that period of time. It's not timeless. It's society that doesn't move enough. So this is the other things that also interest me about fashion, not as a designer, but also as a curiosity to understand how come that people are willing to accept such a radical thinking when it comes about the thing that they wear, and they are not willing to accept that in the way that we live. So this is something that it bothers me and pisses me off. And I always look at fashion with a healthy sense of, and again, I'm not talking about the commercial, superficial side. I'm talking about the creative side of that. And the idea that the whole multi-billion industry is predicated in the constant pushing for innovation and new ideas, and that's what we give them. So they create a need and they create a desire that we didn't know that would exist until we see it. Not different, let's say, than Steve Jobs, but and I get back to that in a bit when I talk about Miuccia Prada. But as I was mentioned, Alexander McQueen and John Galliano, they are like bridges and transition between the traditional, very hands-on to understand, and people more like Martin Margiela and Ray Kawakobo. Martin Margiela, which also is a very mysterious figure. If you Google him, there are almost no pictures of him. Nobody even knows if the guy really existed or it was a collective group. So there's all this mysticism about it. But what Margiela did was to really push, unlike Alain Galeano, he had no interest whatsoever to build a bridge with the tradition of it. And he would really disrupt completely the notion that clothes were completely autonomous from what they use it. And also it didn't need to reflect any sense of tradition or sense of elegance or proportion. So he started his career getting clothes from the Salvation Army and deconstruct them and reassembling them. And that became it, assuming that he's real and assuming that he's one person and not a collective group. But for the sake of this, let's assume that he exists. He started to understand and manipulate this into a territory, which again, it was born out of an idea of necessity and an economy of radicality, but at the same time, it has a Duchampian quality in the fact that because it's done with a lot of sophistication, it's done a lot with somebody who understands how to do this, ergo became fashion by the definition that who's doing, in the same way that when Duchamp get the urinal and put it in a museum and call it art. So there is a kind of a Duchampian thing, and you can start to trace parallels between architecture, art, and fashion all the time, and how these people go back and forth in thinking in these terms. So there is a kind of a Moebius logic that, again, I think you start to realize with that. By the way, Maison Margiela never been that commercially successful. So when it got bought by big companies, because there is a prestige also, and there is a marketing idea that you can have a losing money company, but is recognized as a level of innovation that's applied to another change of commerce. Again, this is something that architects were not that good about trying to figure out that part. And of course, again, there is a certain, the other element which I find interesting in fashion is the idea of nuance. The idea that like when you do a boot or when you do a shoe or when you do a coat, you don't break away completely with everything. There is always enough genetic code, there is enough genealogy of the type that the thing is coming. There are there are less in a coat or less in a dress, there is more in a shoe. The shoe is one of the most difficult things to break away from typology, but there still will be ways to start to think about it and to rethink about it and go back to historical reference and then to split the toes and stuff like that. But that part is also a fascinating one. The idea that the capacity of fashion have to operate in what I will call radical innovation by nuance, by subtlety, not necessarily that everything needs to be reconfigured like sometimes we feel too tempting in architecture. Again, you can see what I mean by that in the boots and this in this dress. And of course, like one of the signature pieces is the puffy bag that it looks like a pillow, but it's a bag. And by the way, also the branding, if you look at the number, there is a whole series of numbers there. So it's almost, there's no signature in the brand. It doesn't send Margiela anywhere. They have always these codes. So it is a way to create an identity by hiding identity, which is also something that we see in many other fields as well. I was talking about Miuccia Prada, and there are all, again, these are informal, not long talks. Each of these designers and each of these houses and each of these brands has very long, and some of them have very long and fascinating stories. Like Prada was a luggage and leather company, and then when Miuccia Prada inherited the company, decided to transform into something else. Miuccia Prada never got educated as a fashion designer. She had a graphic design and art education. So she was very obsessed to try to reconfigure, and again, in the same, and again, Martin Margiela and Ray Kawakobo was a big influence to all these people, but there was this desire to start to produce, to keep emphasizing the autonomy of this, the idea of the art as a form of fashion, or the object of the object as a sense of fashion. But some of you, many in the audience, in this small audience that we have today, many of you are very young. But for those of us who are a little bit older, when we saw in the 90s the first shoes and Prada start to appear, they looked like they were coming from somewhere else. They looked completely unelegant. They didn't look like supposed to look. But within 2 or 3 or 4 months or 6 months of looking, you couldn't believe that shoes could be anything else but this. This is the extraordinary capability that he has that. And it's not just advertising. It's a way to penetrate the collective culture, the collective zeitgeist, to the idea to keep creating these objects of desire. And again, they're expensive, but they're expensive in a way that they're more or less reachable. And also, Prada was one of the first ones that started to produce this called the red line, the Lina Rosa, which is slightly cheaper than some of the other products. So, like Armani would start with Armani Exchange and so on, they all start to see the benefit of that and the idea to create identity, to create multiple level of qualities of value and price. And again, it's not, it's nuance, it's subtlety. So this is an Oxford shoe on the top with certain characteristics of a British traditional Oxford shoe, but with the air chamber, more like in the Nike technology on the bottom. And again, this was something that 20 years ago was not acceptable. Nobody would wear a suit with this 20 years ago. This is how fast things change in that world. And of course, then she goes back and forth in a collection to have like only black and white to go to explosion and colors. And they keep going back a mutation of that. So again, is also there is a lot of innovation here. For example, this use a lot of digital print on fabric. When that came, completely changed the way that fashion was done. Before that, you had to capture the figure of the pattern. The pattern was doing to ink and ink. But then they start to do the digital patterning. So they start to liberate also innovation. They can go back to certain more conventional figures and start to play way more with graphics and patterns on top. That sounds familiar. That doesn't sound something that we've been doing in SCI-Arc for the last 4 or 5 years. With a lot of architects, with the digital, we discovered that you can get a lot of mileage and going back and revisit certain kind of a platonic geometries and really exacerbate the graphic quality on top of it. So again, even if you pay attention or don't, things influence us. And of course, hairy and fair. Again, you will take a conventional bag and you just put it hairy and you put some things. So typologically, there's not a challenge here. There's a material challenge and a perception challenge. And the same, you can put hair in the end of a jacket. It's a fairly conventional power suit, but it has hairs at the end. And of course, companies like Prada, Miuccia Prada, they have an interest and association with graphics and architecture. I mean, this was incredibly important. It was an interior, it was a retail store, but this was a project and a building, and the whole world of architecture talked for a whole freaking year when OMA did the flagship for Prada in New York. It was incredibly innovative because actually 85% of the real estate is occupied by air. So the amount of clothes and the amount of goods that they display is incredibly small. It was the idea, again, to create a cultural identity, to the idea that fashion is not something that is only superficial, something you wear. It's a way to see things and to understand. And of course, I understand there is a lot of criticism and there's a lot of frivolity in this and there's a lot of superficiality, but it's undeniable the influence that these things have in the day-by-day life, and it's undeniable the marriages and the partnership that these create with other creative fields, and it's undeniable that it trickled down all the way to some of our more basic garments and so on. The one on the right is the Prada Foundation that also OMA did. The only reason I'm showing this is because there is also the idea of the cultural zeitgeist of design coming together. This is, of course, Prada Tokyo by Harrison and the Meron. So coming closer to the other aspect, which is the notion of virtuosity and the notion of expertise. This is an industry that even with all the post-industrialization, with all the ultra robotics, automatism, and all that, still rely on the virtuosity and the vision of the creative mind who runs the company. In this case, Alexander McQueen, again, this was one unfortunately close to his death, but this was when he would start to work with laser cutting and digital printing. But all his ability was tailored in learning the tradition of tailoring in Savile Row, which is the mecca of tailoring for men's suits in the world, in London. So you will see all over his career, even though with the influence of all the violence and disturbing and outside the realm of, of fashion that he was interested in, there was a fundamental tailoring into his work. But the other thing which it was remarkable of him was the idea of the performance. Alexander McQueen, when the company was, when he was still alive and the company was already bought by the Gucci group, he never spent $1 in advertising. But when Alexander McQueen was alive, he never ever spent advertising in Vogue or New York Magazine or anything. He would spend all the money in setting up this artistic installation performance for his fashion runways. So this, the one that you see here, was the first ever broadcasted online fashion show in history. It was Plateau's Atlantis in 2009. It has also these robots that they will follow the model. So he understood that by doing that, but elevating our fashion to an art performance, he will get a lot of press and he will get a lot of more reviews than he spent money in advertising. So there was a different conception also about the notion of fashion, but also it speak about his interest, not about the strict commercialization of fashion, but it was much more about the notion of art in motion or art that you can wear, or the idea to bring to wrap yourself in culture. And he also collaborated with artists, and he collaborated with a lot of people who were very radical thinkers. And again, he embraced the idea of the runway as a one of a kind. Which the runway also has an interesting idea, which for architects, I find the one interesting, which is you have to have a coherent message between each of the pieces, but each of the pieces have to stand by themselves. So it's a different kind of a coherence. It's a coherence that happens by accumulation of pieces and not by a singular concept. Even though it may have a concept, the deployment of each of them just by the demand or what you need to produce of variation from piece to piece is enough to throw that away. And of course, he will put things that they were impossible to commercialize, like the shoes for the collection. This will never made it to be used. As a matter of fact, a couple of models refused to wear them because they were afraid to fall. But they were sold later on art pieces. The same with these hats, which are again the product of an artisan he was always working with. Or early on, he was using robots and painting. So he finished his show with a white dress, and the dress became colored by using car painting robots. Again, this is early 2000 or 1999. So way ahead of the curve what everybody was trying to think about artistic things over. Again, it's not that way ahead of the curve all the time because they're all geniuses or whatever. It's because the industry demands it. It's a creative industry that is built on the idea they had to keep producing new stuff. And of course, after he died, he reached cult celebrity status. So the Met show on Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty, it was one of the most attended shows ever in the museum. But also, again, the uniqueness of each one and the decay and the idea that in this case with feathers and many things that you will see later that it made into our schools, they made into architecture, guilty as charged. I mean, when I started working with feathers and hair, it was partially inspired by people like Alexander McQueen and others. But it has a level of freedom. But again, the notion of how you can control it and have full control of the product is an extraordinary one. And of course, this is a little diagram, it's too small to see about his perfect technique of tailoring. So again, the notion of embrace tradition, like Francis Bacon, seems like it's a very British thing to really embrace tradition and figure out a way to break away and to innovate without abandon tradition. Even with the men clothes and again, digital prints and so on. Now, it brings me to the last part of this, which is my favorite of all of them, Ray Cavacobo. I think she is extraordinary, the founder of Comme des Garçons and Dover Street Market. She's a completely different thing altogether. There is somebody speaking. I don't know if you can hear what the guy's saying in the movie. It doesn't matter. It's not saying nothing important. The only reason I'm checking is because if I should speak over or you guys are listening to voices. anyway, it was called, I mean, that was the show that they did on Hair on the Met, but then that was part of the collection called In Bad Taste. And for those of you who were in my studio, this studio, I call it this year, Not Making Architecture, based on her last collection that was called Not Making Dresses or Not Making Fashion. But to me, what it makes so revolutionary about her work is, again, the combination of the sophistication of the couture with very cheap materials. And the idea of the high, low, and high and low collapsing into one. And this is something incredibly innovative, but at the same time, it is this notion that tradition can be revisited and tradition can be mutated. The reason I don't have more slides about her, because I want to go back in one of the next parenting talks about doing a parallel between her work and the work of materiality. So I'm going to elaborate way more on Rei Kawakobo in a couple of weeks when I talk something else. But I wanted to point it out because I think she was one of the biggest disruptors, but also she completely changed the idea of commerce about it. The notion, again, each of with the Comme des Garçons store, but also more recently with Dover Market Street, in which they not only sell Comme des Garçons, but they sell multiple brands that she curates and she finds affinity. So was the idea to transform a store into a museum or something that needs to be curated. And she personally curated every change of the store. So in many ways, part of what she gave up to do the design of the clothes in the last 4 years, because she's much more interested in curating each of these spaces as a place for life in which the fashion, they are the inhabitants of that. So she's not necessarily curating for the people to buy, which of course they want to make money, but also she's curating these spaces for the clothes. The idea that the clothes have their own, I mean, this is the ultimate extreme autonomy. But again, the notion of using some of the most latest, the latest technology, some of the most sophisticated techniques of fashion, but mixing it with cheap materials, and in this case also fusioning with a future system architecture firm in London that they did many of the Comme des Garçons and Dover Market. But this idea that is urban culture, this idea that fashion is mobile art and mobility, or architecture mobility. There is something remarkable about that. And again, it doesn't give up any sophistication, but they think I was talking about the high and low. Again, it's an issue that you see a lot in our schools and other schools of architecture in the last 4 or 5 years at different agencies of contamination to get us away of the strict rigidity of the digital domain. And of course, he's not alone among the fantastic Japanese designer yohji Yamamoto, which probably most of you know him through the white tree that he in collaboration with Adidas, but also he has his own brand, yohji Yamamoto, in which, different than her, he embraced the ultra sophistication of materials and fabric, and tried to do it with very single touches. So one of his goals is to do the least amount of stitching to create as much shape as you can with the manipulation of stitching. But everybody knows that in fashion, that historically there were 2 ways to do it. One is by patterning, that you cut basically the pattern of the body, and the other one is by draping, in which you accommodate fabric. He does both and none of them at the same time. So his work, and again, if you put it in relation with somebody like Su Fujimoto, or you put it with Toyo Ito, is pretty much embedded in that idea that is recognizable enough to belong to the tradition and elements of fashion. And then there are subtlety, but this, unlike Rei Kawakobo, with Rei Kawakobo have much more interest in pop culture and everyday life. He's a different idea of sophistication. His idea of street culture get subliminal, to get transformed by act of sublimation, if I can use that expression. But of course, then he has the most commercial side and the most accessible thing with white tree, like Prada also, to use incredibly innovative materials and super contemporary materials and mix it with informality and technology that come from the culture of sport, or the culture for high performance, like the companies like Nike and Adidas are developing, and trying to transform that. And it's a way, in many ways, that we all dress today, and it's a way that it has shaped how we all dress and how we've been slowly abandoned. And the idea of formal and informal doesn't mean that much anymore. There is an expectation, almost like a tribal way to think how you should dress. I mean, there is always a joke about how architects dress in one way and artists dress in a different way and so on. But ultimately, what it does is, without us maybe paying enough attention, it keeps changing our life, and it keeps changing how we live, and it changes how we relate without paying attention to it, and how the features get exaggerated. So, because again, the typology, if we complain architectural typology, when it comes to the world of fashion, is even more complicated, because the typology is the body and what it has been established. So it's all about augmentation and addition and transforming and reconfiguring, but in a way with much more limited boundaries, which is, I also find that fascinating. This is not a fashion designer I particularly like what he does, but I like the concept of it. Issey Miyake, unlike Rei Kawakowo and like yohji Yamamoto, he goes for a much more minimal approach, in which it's all about the fabric. It's all about the elasticity and the innovation to the material, and almost get rid of any kind of a formal manipulation by just work with the material, connected, use geometry to control it, and produce this kind of a very rigid things, visually geometric, but actually very light how they move. But again, they all emphasize kind of an autonomy of the body from the fashion. And of course, the relation with architecture. This is Frank Gehry, a store for him in New York. Now, to wrap it up, and this one I don't want to elaborate, I want to also talk about where we are right now, which is with companies like Bettermans and Supreme and so on, in which the street culture get elevated and commercialized as high end. So I mean, they're probably Bettermans, Supreme are some of the most known, but probably Virgil, Abloh, and Off-White is the most the most powerful of all these cases. I mean, Virgil Abloh, which is an architect by training, worked with Ren Koolhaas and OMA. So in a way, Bettermans and Supreme and all that, they use the notion of signage and graphics, and again, incredibly typological, recognizable garments. But it's all about the graphics, but also this idea of the culture, the hip hop street culture, elevated through, I'm not even sure high quality of confection, high quality of fabric, but pricey. By elevating it, might just make it expensive. Now, Virgil Abloh, again, working with OMA and Rem Koolhaas, it comes with a whole different idea, which if you look at it, there is a lot of a close relation with a lot of Ren Koolhaas thinking in relation to architecture, in which, if you really think the innovation of Ren Koolhaas in architecture always has been through the scripting and the narrative, and not so much in the language. Actually, if you look carefully to any OMA project, it's always made out of pieces of modern architecture that we can recognize. But it's the way of the political, social message of it. And I understand that in fashion, this is something that you will not think so much. But if you think Off-White is not black, is not white, is Off-White, is somewhere there. And he started his career buying polo t-shirts, putting stamps, buying t-shirt for $50 and selling for $300 with a stamp. So there was this idea of almost like DJing, like electronic music, sampling, and using urban culture and use things that surround us. So a lot of recognizable qualities in their work, like putting in a shoe foam and air or socks or all the things, is something that Ren will do, which is idea the signifier. But also it has a close relation with construction clothes, with clothes that people use in airports. So it's things that surround us and get reconfigured, resampled, and elevated by subtlety, again, or overuse of signage, and also is embracing and pushing to the limit this notion that we all are, in a way, in a way, everybody almost laughing at the consumers, and the idea that we all want to have a brand, and he is like over the top. It's not only the brand of white, it will brand every piece, so there's no confusion about what it is. But also, again, it's this idea of the narrative. It's fashion through narrative. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot of expertise in the team that he works with. But again, it's about the notion of DJing, and it's the most contemporary notion of sampling or kit bashing, if you want. So I like his stuff. I don't look for inspiration for it. I like it as a fan. I don't find it that useful and interesting for me as a designer, but I thought it was important also to address that, and to the point that it started from the street, and then it made it all the way that he became the creative director for the main line of Louis Vuitton. So you have one of the most conservative traditional fashion companies that hire one of the most street savvy, provocateur designers, trendsetters. And so this was he started to take Louis Vuitton. And again, you can read the identity of Louis Vuitton, but it gets tweaked and touched and manipulated through this, to the resembling, restructuring, resignifying things. To finish miscellaneous, I was just joking because there's a lot of Frank Gehry stuff, the fabric or Gerhard Richter. This I put it, which was this is the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Fashion. So it starts to move in other things, and we're gonna see it through the crisis we're going through, in which I think fashion and garment and body armors, these things that protect us from ourselves and from others and help us to build our identities, is going to take us to the next steps. These are some of the interactive things in which this came with oxygens and other things, and repellent materials and so on. But of course, it had to do also with movies, and Ruth Carter, which is a phenomenal costume designer in Hollywood. I'm gonna leave it here so we have time to chat. I think there's some things already in the chat. Yeah, the sound is fine. There was nothing important saying, the guy was nothing saying important. Yeah, we are thinking about the postgrad about fashion, architecture of the body. So this is something that we have in the pipeline, in the mention. I don't think we are that many of us. It's only 24. So if you guys want to talk, just talk. We don't need to use the chat today. You mentioned in the strengths of radical innovation by nuance. What is the value of more extreme artistic innovation as seen in the spectacle of the right way? Do these more extreme proposals take away from the strengths of innovation and nuance? I think it does. I don't think they're, Larissa, I don't think they're contradictions. I honestly think, and I don't know many of them, but I have the feeling that there is a component that they find this a liberating moment in which they are not obligated by the commercial obligation that they have in the ready to wear of the thing. So I think the runway is a moment that they can liberate imagination forward. I will say it's a little bit like if you're an architect and you get to do museums versus doing a single family home, or versus doing a high school. So I think we all crave for those moments, or doing pavilions or doing exhibitions. I mean, I always wonder why super great architects bother to do a pavilion, or they super bother to do furniture, because I think we all crave for moments and you can produce that extreme autonomy. So I don't see it. I don't see that they cancel each other. I see it as two different things. I mentioned the interest of the radical innovation by nuance, because this is something I'm incapable of doing. And as a designer, I'm not capable to do radical by nuance. I do radical by radical in the most banal and stupid way. So this is something I look with admiration and fascination. But in the few things that we've done in recent times in the office, we get involved a little bit more into fashion. I will not call it fashion, but I will call it body architecture. We've been doing some projects on it. It's tough because, again, when we work on the series of shoes that we were working on, it's incredibly typological, and you cannot really mutate the whole thing. It's very subtle the room that you have to maneuver in it. It is very like furniture. You have to do a chair. People have to sit, so people need to be able to put the ass on the chair. So that already precludes. It comes with other preconditions. So I look at that as a fascinating problem, but I honestly find fashion way more useful for us when we look outside into other creative disciplines. I find fashion, honestly, even in my book right now, I find it even more useful than art. I find much more ways to communicate, to understand what they're doing, and find way to translate into the work that I'm interested in doing, and with art, for sure, with car design or any other form of design. As I said, we don't need to use the chat. We are not that many today, so feel free to just talk. Alonso, thank you for the great talk. What do you think about the incursion of fashion into film? Tom Ford opening interesting intersection between genres. Yeah, actually, I like Tom Ford as a filmmaker more than I like him as a designer, as a fashion designer. I don't get me wrong. I mean, these glasses are Tom Ford, so I like certain minimal things that he does, but I find what he does incredibly boring as a fashion designer. But I thought his film was a pretty interesting one, and I think it was incredibly. I spoke with somebody recently from the film industry, like how interesting they were, how what Tom Ford did, because apparently the people that were working with him, he brought a completely different way to see it, and he was super clear to the director of photography and to all the people in the team. Like apparently, he was one of the most clear-minded guy. How the vision that he had to construct the movie. So I think I think we live in an era, honestly, and I hope that if anything, this talk, or at least my talks, not the other people I'm bringing, but mine it's just a way to say that I think it's all material for us to design, and they're all words and we can operate. And I wish I would understand that early in my career. I don't know, my career would be different by now, but I think we live in an era that even by not only, I don't think it's just a software and technology thing. I think it's a cultural thing in which we're sharing a lot of common language. And I think it's much more easy for you to get to understand with each other with in different fields than it was before. I personally, I don't know, I find a lot of common ground when I speak with somebody like John Hawk in Nike than I find with talking with many other architects. So because their interest, how they think about it, how they go around. So I'm all for it, and I hope that you guys are all encouraged by doing that, and I hope that all of you explore those possibilities. Ming is asking, do you think that fashion is taking over art and how is appropriated by daily artifact? Yeah, I think so. At least for me, yes. I'm way more interested. Also, because I'm way more interested in the cost effective of it. Again, I'm not going to deny that some of these brand things are expensive. But if you compare by relation, I don't know, if you can buy a kind of a limited edition of Nike done by Comme des Garçons or of white, okay, you're going to pay like 600 or 700 bucks. It's a lot of money for a pair of shoes. But if you think in terms of if you give them the value as a designer, as an object, as a uniqueness, actually it's way cheaper than buying any piece of art that you can buy. And you can use it and you can wear it. I don't know. I'm all for that, those things. And also, I find super interesting what happened with H&M and Zara and all those things, which, again, for those of us who are a little bit older, me and you and me, when we were younger, we were kids, you didn't have that options. You didn't have accessible clothes that they were following the trends by its more expensive fashion and a reasonable price. There was no such thing. So it's not just the high-end thing, it's a trickle down that it does. And also the way that everybody can build their own personality and you can combine things and you can wear anything with everything. That all was driven by this thinking. Larissa, yes, maybe we can look more easily into fashion than art because fashion similarly operates with the consumer market. Fashion is also similar, great with vision, ethic, economy, etc. Yes. I mean, unlike art, you cannot do fashion in your garage, and you need a consumer. You need somebody who buy it. I mean, art too, but art is such an autonomous thing. Actually, I really think if architects we will learn more about, not learn more, if we were less embarrassed or less disturbed by the idea of commerce and creativity. I mean, like you will never have a conversation with anybody in fashion that they don't talk about how much it's going to sell or how many pieces we're going to sell and how this became something that you can produce. And there is a lot of innovation in relation to it. In architecture, it seems like either you are a commercial-oriented firm and you're a corporate firm and you don't do interesting work, or you're a boutique firm that you struggle to convince clients to do your work. So I say this with that curiosity too. To me, my curiosity in fashion is not just because it's inspiring, interesting in design. It's because I'm fascinated how shameless they are in a good way about that. And we are the most religious maybe profession when it comes to do things. And I'm guilty of charge. I will be the first one to trash other architects that are more commercial and so on. So I'm not I'm not excluded from that. But as you guys are younger people and younger architects, I want you to rethink about that a little bit and to be much more the power of look. It's a very simple. It's a simple idea. Intellectual freedom comes with money. You can get to do what you want to do if you have people who pay for it. And we are, and I will say we're guilty of charge, and this is something that we want to give. I want to bring more to SCI-Arc and be very open about this. That we are, but not SCI-Arc, architecture at large. We are all clueless. We are absolutely clueless about this. So this is an important thing. Anush, what you will suggest how to start the career in fashion industry? I don't know. I think I can tell you examples that I know. Tom Ford is an architect. Virgil Abloh is an architect. Miuccia product is a graphic designer. Okay, she doesn't come, but she goes to inherit the company from the family. Okay, that one is a little bit more difficult. But Tom Ford studied architecture and realized that he was not into it. So he decided to go to Paris and took an internship, I think in Givenchy. And he started from the bottom and he rise to the top. Virgil Abloh, I told you the story. He was an architect, he worked in OMA, he was broke, he decided to start doing things with t-shirts, and then he started collaborating with Kanye West, with the Yeezy thing, and so on. Pretty much all of them they have very, by the way, Ray Kawakowo never studied fashion either. She studied art. Her mom was an art professor and her father was, I think, a poet. She studied art and she did art for a while and then she started doing that. And she started with her own thing. As I said, Martin Margiela, if he exists, apparently he studied fashion, but he started going to the Salvation Army and buying suits, whatever, for $1 or whatever money was in Belgium at the time, and doing that and start selling in smaller stores. I think more often than not, I will say it's the same thing if you want to work in architecture, you want to work in film. Find somebody that you admire, go and knock the door and tell them to let you work with them. That's what I think. I mean, that's what I did for Enrique Mirages. I jumped in a plane, I went to Barcelona, I knocked on his door and said, I want to work for you. And the guy told me, we are full now, come back in a month. So I went monkey around in Spain and come back a month later and I started working for him. I think sometimes people make more fuss about things than what we think it is. And again, I didn't follow some of those things. When I was a student in Columbia, Joel Kosinski was my classmate. And we were classmates in Colombian architecture. Joel Kosinski is a fairly known filmmaker now. He did Oblivion and Tron. Him and Dean DeSimone, as soon we graduated from Columbia, they started a render company. The famous white render at the beginning of Mental Rape, Scott Cohen became famous for, that was done by Joel Kosinski and Dean DeSimone. Then he realized that he didn't want to do renders for architects. He moved to LA and went to work for a visual effects company James Cameron had at the time, and he started from the bottom as a simple animator. He made his way up, blah, 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 then eventually he got to direct. So pretty much any story that you know, it's a little bit like that. So I think first you have to have ideas and you start to work on it. And more than ever today, you will find an audience. I kid you not. I don't know, you guys were in the lecture with John Hawk, talk about how he started in Nike. Okay. He's dyslexic. So when he was 12 or 13, he sent a sketch of a shoe to Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. He studied architecture, was working for Michael Graves. He was working all the product design Michael Graves. And he wanted to do something else. So he wrote the fax to Phil Knight with the original, because Phil Knight responded to him as a kid saying, when you grow up, call me or whatever, write me. So he sent a fax to Phil Knight with a sketch when he was 12, and Phil Knight said, "Okay, come to Beaverton, and we will meet." And he got hired as a designer, and then now he's the chief designer of Nike. So the only thing I'm saying is, bottom line, you have to do what you want to do. I mean, go for the people they admire, or do your thing and find audience. Today, everybody's looking for ideas. Everybody wants to have architects in the team. So it may be in the economy that we're going through right now, it's a difficult one, it's a tragic one, but I'm telling you, there's a lot of industries that are looking for architects because we are the only guys left that we are experts in being generalists. So the reason why so many people that in the world of fashion, film, and so on, they come from other backgrounds, is because usually you have more original ideas when you come from a different background. Yeah, Ming is right. The problem is that people drive a Lamborghini where Margiela living in a two-door mansion. Yes, that's a problem. But Ming, I will say this. You're right, and we talk about this many times. We have to start to look in the mirror. What are we doing wrong that we cannot communicate with people that are willing to have, forget about Lamborghini is expensive, but even if you have a good Toyota Prius, it's a very advanced design. You have an iPhone, you have cool things. Why are you living in a two-door mansion? What are we doing wrong as architects that we cannot communicate with the people who are willing to wear avant-garde things? They're willing to buy avant-garde things, but they're not willing to live in an avant-garde architecture. It's an interesting problem, and I think we need to reflect us as a field. What are we doing wrong? And again, what is our version of the runway? What is our version of advertising and fashion? I think sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot when we say those things. Architecture needs to be timeless. Okay, we say that so many times that people start to believe that. So people want a modern house, which is an idea from 1920. They want it in 2020 because we keep saying that thing. So I don't know, it's an interesting conversation. I wish architecture was more like fashion. Imagine that every 5 years, the client came back to you and said, "I want a new house because I hate this one. I cannot live this anymore. It's like, I cannot wear this anymore." Like, I assume they all do the same. We all keep clothes from 10 years ago with the hope that they will come back because fashion came back. And it came back, but it always came back with a tweak. It's never the same version. So it's not the same jacket. It's not the same pants. It's not the same shirt. So you can really never wear. Imagine if we can do that with architecture. That would be really cool. That would be really cool. Jesse, I often hear in architecture discussion that desire is a cliche, dated or diversional term. Is working with desire trying to make architecture leverage design okay to do? I mean, this is not the term of the director of school to say, but fucking yes, of course, man. Like, this is what we need to learn from all these other people. They create, I mean, first you have to create a desire for something that you didn't know that you desire. I mean, this is what all these people have in common. This is what fashion have in common. This is what film have in common. This is what Steve Jobs has in common with. They create a desire for something that people didn't know they wanted until we put it in front of us. That's the story I was telling about Prada. I remember like it was today. It was in 97 in New York. I walked by this Prada store. I looked at these weird shoes, and I thought that was the ugly thing I saw in my life. 6 months later, I was saving dollars to say when I can buy a pair of Prada shoes. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. So yes, I think it's desire. I think it's motivate creativity. It's what motivates us as human. This is why I always talk about this idea of form, function, function. It was an invention done by lazy people and lazy teachers, because function is the easy thing to teach. It's the easiest thing to teach. Don't let anybody to tell you otherwise. The difficult part is the other part. It's form, desire, aesthetics. That's the difficult part to teach, and it's a difficult part to learn. But it's what motivates us human. Nobody wants to be an architect. It's not like when you think in the visual, you think, wow, the bathroom was so well put in that house. That's not what motivates you to be an architect. Function, I mean, every clothes does the same thing, but there is the reason why we desire certain clothes more than others. A car, a Hyundai, or a Tesla, they do exactly the same thing. They take you from point A to point B. A cool watch or a shitty watch, they do the same thing. They give you the time. Is desire? Yes, we have to leverage desire. I think we suck at that. We need to do that. We need to create that idea. So please don't leave that behind when you leave SCI-Arc. This is something you have to carry on with you. You have to know it by now with all the reviews, right? You notice how critics react to a good-looking project and a bad-looking project. If it's a good-looking project, they're gonna forget everything they were criticizing and saying wrong about the previous one. They're not gonna talk you about. They're not gonna tell you about the strategy, the program, the values, all those things. We throw that when the project is not so interesting. The moment that you look, you're in front of a glorious, well-designed project. Everybody find a way to say that this is great, and actually it makes the discussion most difficult because it's difficult because, come on, we are designers. We know it when we see it, and you know it. You know when the classmate beat you. You know when the classmate did a better project than you. We all know it. And it's that, it's desire, Jesse, it's that thing, it's that je ne sais quoi, that unknown quality. I always said that design is a little bit like trying to explain to somebody why you're in love with the person that you're in love with. You can categorize, you can explain a bunch of things, but the essential thing, you cannot explain it. And this is the same about design.
Hi, Hernán. Can I say something?
Yeah.
I like making clothes for myself, and I was doing it like before I come to SCI-Arc. But after coming to SCI-Arc, I realized that when you study architecture, I didn't study fashion, or I don't know much about it. I mean, I know because my mom was a seamstress, but I didn't study that. Yeah. But after coming to SCI-Arc, I realized that if you have a very, very different view, like not studying fashion, just think as an architect. You can be very, very, you can be different, you can design different. And I decided when I was going to make clothes for myself, I was like, okay, I want something very, very easy. I want to be super lazy, and I want to use only the stuff that I have. And I realized I was like, whatever I was making for myself, my mom was like, oh, what is this? Are you gonna wear this? This is like so simple. This is like she didn't even like that. But my friends from like the one who studied architecture or art, they liked it. So to Anush, when she was asking how I can be an art, how I can go like towards fashion, I'm just gonna say that you can just start making things for yourself and don't think that you know nothing.
Absolutely.
Just start making something, and don't try to even mimic fashion designers, or just make something to wear, and then you'll see that.
Yeah. By the way, you know that Zaha Hadid in her early career, pretty much every picture that you see her with all the cool clothes, she did more than half of it. So Zaha, for the longest time, she used to do her own clothes.
Yeah. Just
I like your clothes.
Oh, thanks.
I saw it, yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, you don't even need to know how to sew. Just even if you don't know how to sew, you can just, I don't know, sew them with like pins or whatever that you think. You can just attach them together so you can wear it. As long as you can wear it, it's clothes.
One thing for you to think about, you were saying about lazy, which is sometimes being lazy is a good thing.
Yeah,
Stephen Wright,
exactly.
the comedian, have a great quote that says, ambition is, I forgot, let me see if I can get it exactly. Ambition is a poor excuse for not having enough sense to be lazy. So lazy ideas are good. I mean, sometimes it's good. I'm all for lazy ideas because I think lazy ideas sometimes generate complex projects. It's all good. I mean, at the end, you can start anywhere with it. Larissa, I think it's hard to make a project that works and looks good simultaneously. Yes, it is hard. And it's to make a project that is either functional or beautiful, but good aesthetic are normally more associated with natural talent than the former. Yes, but I'm telling you, to do a functional is not that difficult. It's not. It's very formulaic. To make it look good, yeah, I agree with you. It's difficult. It's difficult. It's difficult. So anyway, one or two more. We had to have dinner here in my house, so they're waiting for me to liberate the kitchen. Okay, guys, thank you for coming.